So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm on staff there. Now we're trying to figure out what Jesus-centered family on mission is. I feel like I say this every time, but it is true every time. If you don't have graduation plans, please move and help us. It would be great. So tonight we're going to be continuing in our series, You Are Here. And so if this is your first night with us, or maybe you've been back, kind of this idea of You Are Here is we want to talk about the statements in our culture, the things, the truths that our culture spits out, and ask, are they actually true? Do we as believers, do we as Christians, do we as the church actually think these statements that we just say mean anything? Is there truth behind them? And so we want to take a step back and put a magnifying glass on these and just talk about it. And so tonight we're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, relationships and marriage. So you're welcome. Thank you. You can clap. I'll wait. So tonight we're going to be talking about this deep-seated belief, this idea of you will find the one. One day you will find the one, your perfect soulmate that will fulfill you and make you complete, and then you'll never have to be sad again or lonely or angry or any of those terrible feelings that single people have to deal with. Am I right? Yeah, so that's kind of this idea. Is there any truth to that? Is there any idea of finding the one? Is that actually where we can find satisfaction? And we've talked about this idea of American pursuit of happiness, right? Like it's literally in our Constitution. We all have the unalienable right to pursue happiness as Americans. At least that's what our forefathers would have said. And I would argue that there's nothing we pursue more as Americans than romance and sex. There's nothing we want more, there's nothing we run to more than this idea that someone or this sexual or romantic relationship, this feeling, this intimacy is going to fulfill us. And even some of the other things we've talked about in this series, these ideas of like, follow your heart, do what makes you happy, be you, work on yourself, actually in a lot of ways are a means to an end to this idea. You do those things so you can find that perfect someone who will finally be your Prince Charming or your perfect woman, whatever it is for you. And we see this idea, this concept is just all over our culture, right? So if you've watched any romantic comedy ever, then you've seen this. So recently, I may or may not have been watching the romantic comedy Wedding Crashers, which is probably, and regardless of whether I watched it or not, it's an amazing movie. Maybe you shouldn't watch it, but we shouldn't talk about that. So it goes like every other romantic comedy, right? So there's this girl, and she's kind of quirky and different, but you can tell she has like this sensitive side, right? Like she's misunderstood. And then she's like been in a relationship with this guy for 5 years, and even though he's done nothing wrong, at least not in the beginning of the movie, we find out that he does. Even though he's done nothing wrong, we just know they're not right together. Am I right? And then she meets this complete stranger, and we know that they're meant together because of the beautiful music that comes up and the slowed down pace, right? And we're like, immediately, we're kind of like, yeah, leave him. Leave that relationship you've been in for years. There's no way that's a good thing. Be with this guy, the complete stranger that we know nothing about except that he has a cool nose. And then they kind of, they talk. Oh my gosh, they have this connection, this spark. And then whether they kiss or they get married at a baseball game, depends on the rom-com, they end up together, right? And happily ever after, we've all read the book, amazing, right? And so our culture loves this idea, right? But the funny thing is we kind of come at it from two different angles. We kind of have two statements or two beliefs that kind of get fleshed out in very different ways when they're applied. So let me show this to you, or let me pull back the curtain. So the first statement that our culture says is, find your soulmate now. Find your soulmate now. There's nothing else you should be doing. This is the most important thing for you to be running after. Like life's going to be sad and lonely and miserable, and you might as well not exist until you're in a relationship. I mean, that's basically, I didn't say it. That's what our culture says. So like to put this in perspective, this would be like old Taylor, right? Like old Taylor Swift, like teardrops on her guitar. She's just looking for the one. right? Like you belong with me. We're going to get there. We're going to make it. And then we've got another cultural narrative that kind of coincides with this. It's this idea of just you do you. You follow your heart. You do whatever is best for you, right? Even if you doing you means definitely don't tie yourself down to a relationship. Are you kidding me? That would be terrible. We've got time to do that later. We don't want to do that now. And nothing can hurt people more than relationships or romance. So I'm not going to commit. I'm not going to be serious. Not going to settle down. It's for losers. It's for chumps until we meet our perfect person. But so that's like new Taylor, right? Like that's like the Taylor that is really sad and writes these terrible songs like "We're Never Getting Back Together," Harry Styles. It's not going to happen. So these are these two ideas, right? These are these two cultural narratives. And I think it would be surprising for us, or I think we might not understand that these ideas are not new. They're actually rooted in about 2,000 years of history. One is rooted in Greek mythology, and the other is rooted in Greek philosophy. So let me explain. About 2,000 years ago in Greek mythology, there was this idea of the soulmate. So the soulmate, basically, the story is that humans were born, and they were perfect, and they were so happy. It was amazing, right? And they had 2 heads and 4 hands and 4 feet, but the gods were so jealous of the humans. They were just so angry. And so what they decided they would do is they would split them up. They would show the humans. And so now we've got to find our other half. We've got to find the person that we were supposed to be with. And once we do that, we'll be happy again. So that's the soulmates thing. And then the other one, the you do you, don't be attached to anyone, comes from Greek philosophy. So it's this idea of stoicism, right? And stoicism is this idea that attaching to anything in the material world is weakness, right? So like we shouldn't care about these material things like relationships or sex, and we shouldn't show emotions, and we shouldn't love because that's immature and weak, and we need to like look in ourselves and like discover who we are, and that's where we find real happiness, not in this materialistic society of nothingness. Yeah, so, super exciting. So those are these ideas. This be single or love the person, find your love, come from Greek mythology and Greek philosophy. Stoicism, soulmate. And so that is where Paul is coming into in the New Testament when he writes the book of Corinthians. He's talking to these people, and they believe one of 2 things. One of them believes happiness is found in finding the person, in marriage. I've got to run after them. I've got to discover them. And the other half believe, no, we should be single. We shouldn't attach to anything. And so what Paul does is he pushes into both at the same time. So 1 Corinthians, if you have your Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians 7, verses 6 through 9. So this is Paul speaking to the Corinthians. Now as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, speaking of his singleness. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So in one move, what Paul is saying is, singleness is a gift, and there are beautiful things that come from it, and marriage is a gift, and there are beautiful things that come from it, but neither is going to fulfill your desires. That's actually not what we're here for. We're not primarily here to be fulfilled, whether it be in marriage or singleness. Another way to say it is singleness and marriage are both good gifts, each with unique benefits. Singleness and marriage are both good gifts. So this is a hard one for us to believe. Most of you are in college, so most of you are not married. I know a few of us are getting married in college. That's a cool trend. I did it myself. But most of us are not married, right? And so when you're not married, I do not care what you say. Wow, that sounded so much meaner than I meant it to. When you're not married, there's this idea that you have that marriage will satisfy you. And like you might know that that's not true, and you might say that it's not true, but part of you is like, but we know it's true. And so I in my own life, I got married when I was 22. It doesn't really matter. I got married in my 20s, like I still am. And my whole life, literally, I don't remember. Like, I wasn't the kid that didn't like girls. Like, I was the kid that liked girls at 3. It was weird. And my whole life is like, I'm going to get married. It's going to be great. Like, I remember my dad told me a story about how I got angry at him because I was talking about how me and my wife were going to live with my parents. And my dad was like, I was 5. Let's relax, okay? And my dad was like, Cole, you know, you're going to move out. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, you're not going to live with us for the rest of your life. That would be ridiculous. And I cried for hours. So the point is, I've always thought about marriage, at least as long as I can tell. And I remember I got married. It was great. Definitely recommend it. It's a gift. So is singleness. Got married, and it was like a week and a half in. Me and my wife, Bethany, she's great, better than me, had an argument. And I was right, but that's not important. Had an argument. I was probably wrong. It was a joke. Please remember to text her that when you talk about this sermon. So I was probably wrong, and I remember having this thought, it was so nice to be single. And as silly as that sounds, or as immature as it was at the time, my heart in that moment, like God really did, he kind of pushed into me and said, you have never once in your life wished that you were single. And it took you 7 days of having what you wanted, what would fulfill you, to want the other thing. It's never going to work. If we look to marriage, if we look to singleness to fulfill us, it will fall short. As believers, the thing that we believe is that our lives aren't even about marriage. They're not even about singleness. The goal for those of us who follow Jesus, whether single or married, is to give our life away, right? The goal is for us to live in such a way that we serve others, not ourselves. So, you guys are in a really cool season, and I thought about this a lot, like how do I talk about this in a non-condescending way or in a way that they wouldn't just like brush it off, because that's what I did, just to be sincere, when people were like, yeah, singleness was great, college was great, you had so much time. It's like, yeah, screw you, man. But genuinely, there are beautiful things about being single, and if you only ever use your singleness to be selfish, you're going to miss out on a huge part of it. Like, you have more time than you will ever have for the rest of your life. And I know that's a weird thing to talk about, but like, I remember, oh my gosh, it was so shocking. Like, now, when I look back at how much time I had, it's just like, okay, so when me and my wife were dating, we dated for like 3 years, I remember we would talk about our weeks. And this is how we would talk about my weeks. And this might be because my wife is humble and loves me very well. But like, it was like, Cole, when can you and I hang out? And it'd be like, well, I am free in these 3 slots. And then we would hang out in one of those 3 slots. I know I'm selfish. It's not the point, okay? But now, it's literally the opposite, right? Like now, not because she's controlling, not because we don't have a good relationship, it's just like we live together. Our lives are connected in every way. So it's not like, when do we have time to hang out? Like, we have to be intentional about hanging out, but it's like, oh, do I have time to go do this thing? Like, I never had to ask if I could go on a trip or if we had the money to do. It's like, it was me. I did what I wanted. I was single. And so what that means is you have a unique time where you can love other people in a way that you just can't when you're married, because your first responsibility is to your spouse. Paul literally talks about this in Corinthians. He talks about when you are married, you have to love the other more than anyone else. It's this idea of you sacrifice for them first, which just means you have less of a capacity to sacrifice for others. So don't use your singleness to be selfish. Don't use this time, don't wish it away just saying, oh man, one day when I'm married, that's when I'll feel fulfillment. That's when it'll be enough, because it won't work. It's just going to fall flat. I was thinking about questions to ask that would be helpful, so I think these work. In what way are you selfishly focused on yourself? And I hated how that sounded, so let me say it a different way. How much of your thoughts are about you? If you had to put your thoughts in a percentage, what percent of your thoughts are about you? What am I going to do today? How am I going to spend my time? I don't know that I want to go help them move. That sounds hard. I don't know that I want to help. I don't want. What percent of your life is about you? Whether positive or negative. It can look like super selfish, but it can also look the other way. Man, I hope that they like me. Oh man, no one it can be, you can be confident. It's the same idea. It's pride at the end of the day. It's about you. What percentage of your thoughts are about you? And then the second question, in what ways have you believed the cultural narratives about sex and romance? In what ways have you believed the cultural narratives about sex and romance so that you turn to that instead of Jesus? So that instead of running to Jesus with your pain and with your sin, you just say, man, this porn's really going to fix this. Or, this guy that I'm dating is really going to do this. This date, this Valentine's, that's what's really going to be enough. This wedding, In what ways do we buy in to the cultural narrative that sex and romance are going to fulfill us and that Jesus can't? And that we shouldn't submit to his commands, because if Jesus understood what he was asking of us, then there's no way a good God could ask that of us. Like, if God really loved me, he wouldn't ask me not to have sex with my girlfriend, right? Are you kidding me? How outdated is that? Maybe that thought process, for example. I don't know. So the Bible's view on singleness and marriage is pretty countercultural. They see them as good gifts. Singleness is a good gift, right? We're going to keep saying this. Marriage is a good gift, but it's not ultimate. The ultimate gift, the only thing that's going to fulfill us, is the love of Jesus, is our relationship with God. And if we go to anything else, including marriage and sex and relationships, to do that for us, we will be crushed. It will never be enough. So our first point, singleness and marriage are both good gifts. Our second point, when romance becomes God, disappointment will follow. When romance becomes God, disappointment will follow. And I think when we look at what Jake read earlier in Genesis, I think this kind of shows this to us better than any story or joke that I could make. So if you have your Bibles, turn in them to Genesis 29, and we're going to start in verse 15. So what this is doing, we're stepping into the life of one of the patriarch. Patriarch is just a fancy word for like father, one of the first fathers of the Jewish people. So Jacob's a big deal, right? So we're stepping into Jacob's life in Genesis, and he's wandering around the desert, just walking around. He's walking around because he stole his brother's birthright. His brother wants to kill him. Not really the point of the story, but just so we know anything about him. And so he's walking around. He's been rejected by his family. He was never enough. He was always the second choice. So he's walking around and he's like, what can fulfill me? Maybe a woman. And so he sees a woman, and her name is Rachel. And this is how the narrative goes. Jacob sees Rachel for the first time, and the first thing he does is he runs up to her and kisses her, which is a little weird. If you kiss someone, or if you make out with someone, or if you jump into a relationship with someone and you have not spoken to them, then it is probably not going to go well long term. So Genesis 29, verses 15 through 20. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall be your wages? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should to any other man. Stay with me. What a nice blessing by the father, right? Like, I guess you're better than anybody else. I guess you'll have to do. Just saying, kind of mean. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Oh, a few days. Isn't that beautiful? Nicholas Sparks, anybody? A few days, those 7 years. So what has happened is Jacob talks to Rachel, well, not really, but he kisses her and falls in love with her. And then he runs to Laban to ask for this girl's hand in marriage. And this is pretty common. This is pretty normal for this time period. And so what he does is says, I want to marry your daughter. I want to marry Rachel. And so it was pretty customary in that time to work for someone's hand in marriage. Like that was if you weren't super wealthy or have something else you could give, this is something you would do. And it's easy for us with our modern Western glasses to read this story and be like, oh my gosh, Jacob loved her so much, like he worked 7 years and it was like nothing. But that's actually a faulty misunderstanding for us. We're doing that because of our culture and what we're seeing. In this culture, when the Jews read this, they would have thought Jacob was an idiot. That would have been their expression. And there's a few reasons why. Customarily, you would work for someone's hand in marriage for about 2 years. That was normal. And like if you really wanted to, 3. And so when Laban and Jacob are talking, right, if you look at the text, Laban doesn't throw out the number 7. Laban doesn't be like, my daughter's really great. My daughter's really great. So I'm thinking 7 years. He's like, okay, you're going to need to work for my daughter. And Jacob, like without thinking, is like, 7 years. I'll do it for 7 years. I'll beat everybody else. No one else is here. No one else is asking. But just in case, I'll make a bid. 7 years. And Laban's like, great. Sounds good. And that's supposed to shock us. We're supposed to be asking the question, why is Jacob so insecure? Like, what's wrong with him that he felt like in order to even get in, he had to go above and beyond what anyone else rationally would do? Well, if you look at Jacob's backstory, there's a ton of insecurity, right? So we touched on this earlier, but this older brother hates him and wants him dead. Jacob is aimless and he's searching for something. He's searching for something to fulfill him. And similarly, for us, our past wounds, our insecurities, they can cause us to be irrational or illogical, especially when it comes to sex and romance. Because one of the beautiful things about sex and romance is there is a real intimacy and a real love that you feel in a marriage relationship, in a sexual relationship, that you don't feel in other relationships. And so it's easy to take a good, beautiful thing and misuse it and say, okay, I'm going to use this thing to fulfill me in a way that it was never supposed to fulfill me. And because I'm doing that, it's actually going to cause more pain and heartache than it was ever supposed to. So I worked in college ministry for about 4 years, I think. And I had a lot of conversation. And then before that, for about 2 years, I was a life group leader. So I've had a lot of conversations with people about dating. Because I don't know if you know this, but when you work with college students, you usually talk about 3 things: sex, alcohol, and then I guess the third category of miscellaneous, which is like mental health, probably. 3 things: mental health, sex, alcohol, which isn't a bad thing. You get good at those 3 conversations because it's everything that you talk about. And so I've had a lot of conversations with people about relationships. And one of the craziest things to me about relationships is people that you talked to a week earlier would say something like, oh, no, I'm following Jesus, like I love Jesus, I would never do this thing. But you enter in a relationship and they just totally, it didn't matter that a week ago they loved Jesus and they would never consider dating a non-Christian. Now, he was really nice. He's really nice. And like he respects my faith. And like he believes in a God. Like he's never read the Bible. He hates church, but, you know. Or another one is like, but like, we don't have sex even though I sleep at my boyfriend's house. We just get under the covers together and cuddle. And sometimes you're having sex and sometimes you're not. It doesn't actually matter, right? Because of emotional, physical, and spiritual boundaries, which we can talk about later. I know things shouldn't go physical too quickly, but if I'm not physical, then they're not going to stay. Or, I know, but we're trying, and I know, like, or if you say, maybe you should break up with someone, maybe this person isn't right for, I've seen multiple year friendships just end because someone was like, maybe you shouldn't date them. Maybe that's not good. Maybe that's not a good idea. I think a way to say it is, in relationships, there's this category of blind spots that I just haven't seen in anything else. And the funny thing that people say about blind spots, but I think is really helpful, is the thing about blind spots is that you don't see them. Which sounds ridiculous. That sounds so absurd, of course, but I can't tell you how many people I've sat across from and said, I think this might be a blind spot for you. Oh, no, I see it perfectly clearly. I know exactly what's going on. You're not seeing it clearly. Okay. But if it were a blind spot, let's just hypothetically, if it were a blind spot, would you see it clearly? No. And would you be aware that you didn't see it clearly? No. So we can agree that if you had a blind spot, right, I would not see it clearly. Right. Well, since it's been 8 seconds since I've said you may have a blind spot, maybe you have a blind spot. I don't know, just a thought. Anyways, that's not the point of this sermon, just saying. Here's another way to say it. Here's a more helpful pastoral way to say it. Boundaries matter. Physical boundaries matter. We're all good at those, for the most part. At least we know they're real. Most Christians, most people that love Jesus, most people that are trying aren't going to argue about that. Like, they may mess up, you may cross physical boundaries, but most people aren't going to walk into the room and be like, it's fine, we could totally have sex. It's never where it's going to go. Emotional and spiritual boundaries matter too. So here's what I mean. There are unique things that you should do with your spouse. Like live in a house together, or share a bed, or share a bank account, or pray together, or have conversations about kids. There are things that you shouldn't have. You shouldn't start to wade in those waters with people. And if you are not good at one of the areas of boundaries, if you're not good at physical boundaries, you will start to cross emotional and spiritual boundaries. If you're not good at emotional boundaries, you will start to cross physical and spiritual boundaries. If you're not good at spiritual, you get the point. Because that's how humans are made. We are supposed to progress together. As we progress in physical intimacy, we are supposed to progress in emotional and spiritual intimacy. So you can't do one of the three. You can't just be way too emotionally connected. It will boil over to physical and spiritual intimacy. And that's not good. That's not the right time. That's not the right place. Let's see how this plays out in Jacob's life. So he worked 7 years like it was nothing. And then finally the day comes. And in Jewish tradition, the way that they did it is they clothed the wife from head to toe. You couldn't see her. Huge party. Jacob probably drunk too much. And wakes up the next morning, and guess what? It's the wrong sister. Wow, isn't that crazy? But seriously, that'd be rough. And so Jacob goes to Laban, and it's like, hey, wrong one. And he's like, didn't I tell you 7 years ago, since we've worked together and lived together for 7 years, and we could have had this conversation, I don't know, every day. Didn't I tell you that my older daughter would have to get married first? No, you forgot to mention that, man. You forgot to say. And so then what does Jacob do? What any rational human would do, right? He says, all right, well, I've already worked 7 years. 2 years is normal. So why don't we just now let's move on? No, that's not what he does, right? Because he's insecure and he's totally connected to his relational idolatry. So he says, I'll just work another 7 years because I'm so broken and so messed up. Awesome. I hate this mic. That this is the only thing I can do, the only thing that would make sense. I'm so unworthy that I would have to work 14 years to marry this girl, even though the normal person would have to work 2. He doesn't even recognize the total abuse. I don't know the other word, like the total destruction that this man has caused both to him and his daughter. Like, can you imagine being Leah? That wasn't fun, right? Like, oh, we're married. I know you didn't want to marry me, but we made it. And then, we're going to be married for 7 years while you work for my younger sister, and you didn't want to get married to me. You think that's going to come up? I think it's going to come up. I think it might be talked about. I mean, goodness gracious. So what happens is Jacob and Leah both run to their romantic idol. So Leah's thrust into this story, right? She didn't do anything wrong, but she's thrust into this story. And what Genesis does is it starts to talk about Leah more than Jacob. We see a shift. The narrative shifts from Jacob's wife to Leah. So this is verses 31 through 35. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, God, can you imagine being hated in your marriage? I mean, seriously. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren, and Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And again she conceived and bore a son. Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name is Levi. So what you see is Leah is starting to believe in this romance idolatry. She starts to do it too. If this kid, right, he'll finally love me. I'll finally be enough. Rachel can't do it. Rachel can't give him a kid. I'll give him a kid. And so she has the first kid, and it's like, no, it didn't work. Okay, but 2 kids. I have 2 boys. I mean, having a boy in this culture is the best thing that you can do. And I've given him 2 sons. Nothing. 3rd son. Nothing. Leah is starting to believe that this romance idolatry, that Jacob is going to be the thing that satisfies her. But then, in verse 35, it takes a shift. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. Point number 3, find contentment in God's love that won't ever disappoint. Find contentment in God's love that won't ever disappoint. You don't have to be like Jacob or Leah. You don't have to believe that you have to earn your love, because Jesus' love has already been earned for you. And the key to life is not going to be your relationship status. I have no idea where we're going to go tonight. I have no idea what our lives are going to behold. I know that if you get married, there are going to be times of joy and pain. There are going to be times of loneliness and happiness. And I know that if you're single, it's going to be the same. Because neither is actually ever going to fulfill you. But what Jesus would say to you, What Jesus would say to both the married and the single in that moment of pain is, come to me all who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I am enough. Nothing else ever will be. To prove it, I want to look back at verse 35, because I think it's easy not to miss something, but it's not the whole story. So the name of Leah's last son is Judah, right? Why does that matter? Why does Judah matter? The reason why Judah matters, the reason why it matters that Judah is her son, is because if we read the rest of the Bible story, people like David come from the line of Judah. And then, thousands of years later, this little boy will be born in a manger, and his name will be Jesus, and he will come from the line of Judah. Jesus comes from the line of the woman whose husband hated her, and she was never enough. The good news about the gospel, the good news about Jesus is that it's not about it's not about your relationship status to find satisfaction. It doesn't matter if you're married or single. It doesn't matter if you're happy or sad. Jesus is the only one that's ever going to be enough, and he will meet you there. He will meet you both in the times of anguish and in the times of joy, in the times of pain and the times of excitement. He's the only one that will ever show up over and over again perfectly. This is why the Bible actually calls the church his bride. We are the bride of Christ because Jesus is the only one that can love us correctly. Not some future spouse, not some disconnected, stoicistic life. Jesus. And I don't know how else to put that. I don't know how else to argue that point. Again, I kept going back to what would I have wanted to hear? What would I have believed when I was in college? And honestly, I mean, I was pretty arrogant in college, so you guys are probably ahead of me. But I don't know that I would have believed it completely. I don't know that I would have believed that marriage or romance or sex wouldn't actually satisfy me. And I've gotten to deal with that pain and that heartache because of that thought process. And kind of what I want to say there is, that's okay. It's okay if you don't believe it completely. God meets you there. God was there with Leah for kid 1 and kid 2 and kid 3 and kid 4. It says in the New Testament that God has begun a work in you that he will bring to completion. So the good news is, even in our lack of understanding, even in our believing that he is not enough, our God will keep chasing after us. Even though we run to broken cisterns over and over again and believe that sex or romance or fill in the blank will satisfy us, Jesus will keep running after us. And then when you finally do realize, when you finally have the Judah moment where you say, oh, God is the only one that will ever satisfy me, his response to you is not anger or disappointment or what have you been doing for the last 6-7 years? His response is, I love you, and I'm here. And when you turn away again, I'm still going to be here. I'm always going to be enough. That's the good news of the gospel, that even in our brokenness, Jesus died for us and ran after us. And he continues running after us. God loved you before the world began. He loves you now and will love you forever. And there's nothing you could ever do, there's no wrong you could ever commit against him that would change that. That's why he died, because he loved you. Let's pray.